as certainly designers, but even as consumers, like we shouldn't just accept what is being offered to us at point blank. We should have conversations and think about and be critical and say, well, what does it mean to have a nanny robot? And what human interaction is that replacing? And is that a value that we support? And why or why not?
Hello and welcome to another episode of Brave UX. I'm Brendan Jarvis, Managing Founder of The Space in Between, the behaviour-based UX research partner for enterprise leaders who need an independent perspective to align hearts and minds. You can find out more about me and what we do at thespaceinbetween.co.nz. Here on Brave UX, though, it's my job to help you to keep on top of the latest thinking and important issues affecting the field of design. I do that by unpacking the stories, learnings, and expert advice of a diverse range of world-class leaders. My guest today is Carla Diana. Carla is an influential designer, author, and educator whose work is at the forefront of the intersection between technology and human-centered product design. She is currently the founder and designer in residence of the Interaction Design program at Cranbrook Academy of Art, where she leads a groundbreaking program dedicated to exploring the future of smart objects, immersive environments, and intelligent systems. Carla's influence extends to her role as former head of design and now design advisor at Diligent Robotics, where she focuses on humanizing robots that assist healthcare workers. Prior to Diligent Robotics, Carla held roles at top innovation design firms Smart Design and Frog Design, where she worked on a range of products from robots to connected home appliances. She is the author of Leo the Maker Prince, the first children's book that introduces the world of 3D printing through an engaging narrative, inspiring young minds to explore the possibilities of making an innovation. Her latest book, My Robot Gets Me, explores how human-centered design makes smart technologies more intuitive and relatable. Carla has been a speaker at well-known conferences and events such as South by Southwest, TEDx, and the Interaction Conference, sharing her insights on the future of design and technology. Her writing has also been featured in prominent publications like Fast Company, The New York Times, and Popular Science. And now she's here with me for this conversation on Brave UX. Carla, a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for that great introduction. I really appreciate your interest in my work.
Oh, you certainly made it interesting and easy for me to cover off all those wonderful highlights. And one of the things that I didn't cover off in the intro is that you currently live in suburban Detroit, but you grew up in New York City, where I understand that your parents didn't have a car. But it sounded to me like that was intentional because you've also previously spoken about how they used to take you overseas and explore the world, but they always chose to do that via public transport rather than get rental cars. Why were your parents so intentional about how you got around when you were traveling?
Well, what's interesting is living in Detroit, I'm just completely immersed in this American car culture where your question is very interesting because they would have had to be intentional to have a car, because when you grow up in New York City, you don't need one. And so it was never even something that was never a choice. It was just the default state of being a New Yorker. So to me, what has been uncomfortable has been living in suburban Detroit, or just larger. Even if I lived downtown Detroit, frankly, I would need a car, and how much that demands of the average family. So I have I have a new project that I'm working on for this coming May, an exhibition that explores this topic from a kind of utopian design point of view. Like, could it be different here in Detroit? But yeah, I mean, my parents didn't even have driver's licenses, and neither did I until I think I was 20 or 21 and graduated. My first degree was in mechanical engineering because I simply wanted to make things. And that's what you pursue, such a thing. And most of the manufacturing jobs would be in suburban New Jersey or someplace where I wouldn't be able to access it by subway. So I said, all right, well, I better better get a driver's license and a car.
Necessity forced your hand there. I understand Detroit has recently been going through a bit of a resurgence. There was a period there where there seemed to be quite a lot of urban decay going on in Detroit. It was kind of a bit sort of downtrodden, and the city spirits weren't so high, but that's been changing lately. And I also understand that Detroit used to have a fantastic public transport system, back in the day. I'm not quite sure just how long ago that may have been, which is somewhat similar to me here in Auckland. We used to have trams and other kinds of forms of public transport that then completely disappeared as roads took over. What you mentioned your project that you're working on at the moment to explore that sound like the future of transport in Detroit. What are the key threads or themes that you're working on in that particular project?
Yeah, so what you're saying is absolutely correct. Detroit in the 30s and 40s had one of the best public transportation systems in the country, and now most of those they were sold off and dispersed for a variety of reasons. It's very easy to say, "Oh, now a lot of industry shut it all down," which is certainly no small part of it, but it's much more complex than that as I've been looking into it. But what I moved here for this amazing opportunity to start this 2-year Master of Fine Art program in design and technology at a really historic institution known for design and art. And, everyone, folks asked me, well, how do you like being there? And I've always felt like, well, everything's wonderful, except the lack of public transportation really bothers me from a community point of view, from the point of view of the isolation that gets bred by every individual being in their own little box and bubble, and having to establish parking lots and parking garages in those public spaces. So that's your first entry point. I mean, I sit at many cafes at a table looking out at a parking lot, and it made me feel like I need to do something about this. And I come at it from my own point of view. So my field expertise, my whole career has actually been focused around the design of smart objects, as you mentioned, and a little more specifically in the last decade around design for social robotics, a specific field in robotics that focuses on how humans interact with machines and how machines are designed for us to understand that interaction. And what came together for me was that right now there is a lot of work going on around autonomous vehicles. And there's a lot of design work that needs to happen from a social point of view. We have vehicles in the street with pedestrians. We have vehicles in the street. And certainly, even if we eventually had all autonomous vehicles, we would have a period of time where we had human drivers and autonomous vehicles. And those drivers, and there are so many subtleties that we don't think about, like making eye contact or gesturing, or when a pedestrian kind of steps halfway into the road, what does a driver do? So, a lot of my peers and friends in the field of design for robotics were working on this. And so I started learning more about how that dovetailed with urban planners and what urban planners saw as the future for autonomous vehicles. And there are a couple of different ways that it can go. And the default way would be for these isolating boxes that we're all in, that drive me crazy, to just have them become autonomous. And then we all have these little living rooms that are, we have a car that's even more expensive that our family has to maintain. Or we could take a look at this confluence of electrification, automation, and sharing economy, and think about solutions that are more community-wide, where we have shared autonomous vehicles and where we have what are, in some of my readings, there's a book I love that's called Ghost Road, that's by Anthony M. Townsend. It talks about what they call software trains, right? Because a lot of cities like Detroit will say, well, we don't have the infrastructure anymore. But there's a sense in which with networked vehicles, then the cloud is the infrastructure, the networking is the infrastructure, right? So you could potentially, in a shared system, have trains that come together and then break apart to go the last mile or last 2 miles. And so that got me really excited thinking about this kind of system as a potential future for Detroit. And so the project that I'm working on is an exhibition that will take place at a place called New Lab. It's part of Michigan Central in downtown Detroit. Michigan Central is the old train station, which was just recently renovated and opened and had a number of public events and is going to be a tech center for Ford. And then there's a more independent space that's called New Lab that is a hub for technology startups. So that's a very long answer, but essentially, the project I'm working on is supported by a grant from the Knight Foundation, and it is me sharing this vision of instead of people call Detroit, Detroit is known as Motown, Motor Town, and my project is called Mobility Town. Out of our cars and into the world. That's the name of the project.
It's a great name. And you mentioned, I think you described cars as, did you call them isolating boxes or something to that effect?
Yeah. Okay, did that. Yes.
Just translating for others in case they missed that subtle jab. I was curious about that description, and in particular as it relates to the sort of social aspects of public transport. Because if you've ever travelled the subway in New York, which I know you have, but if people listening have, or they've travelled the tube in London, or any major city's infrastructure when it comes to shared transport like that, people are together but still alone, and most often glued in their own mini isolating boxes to the screens that are in front of their faces. And so I'd be curious to understand from you what thinking, if any, or what the design challenge might be around how in the future transport, how we might imagine transport in the future, how we might introduce more sort of social permission for people to engage with each other when they're in those shared spaces.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly an accurate possible prediction. And I see exactly what you're talking about. I will say that the project that I'm working on will be pretty broad strokes. I'm collaborating with a projection mapping artist named Motomichi Nakamura, who does these lovely creations with very minimal creatures. And, we're painting a picture on the walls of what this community-based system might be like. But also from the what I'm thinking about for Detroit, I think it doesn't. I feel like your question is drilling down to a real. And I love the book Alone Together by Sherry Turkle. That really delves into. I know that her research really delves into that. But I'm thinking about just some other moments, like for example, just walking, because I feel like the biggest resistance that I've been getting when I talk to people about the project is around folks not wanting to give up or having this mental model of every individual having the car. And I feel like there are two big asks of this picture I'm going to be painting. One is that you may have to wait maybe 10 or 15 minutes as opposed to being able to just jump in your car if you're waiting for this system to put riders together, right? And so that's a big ask. And you may have to walk half a kilometer, quarter of a mile, something like that, right? But in my point of view, I love what that suggests might happen socially, right? It means that's why the project is called Out of Our Cars and Into the World, is this idea of, I'd love to walk a quarter of a mile. Yeah, if it's 2 miles, 4 kilometers is a long way. Half a kilometer, not so much, right? But it opens our eyes and then it opens the opportunity for, boutiques or smaller businesses or community-oriented events and in addition, what's being proposed by urban planners is we would have that if we had these shared vehicles, we would actually have many fewer, say it that way, cars on the road, and as well as in parking. So then we have a lot more opportunity for community spaces, green spaces or park spaces or event spaces, what have you. And so then you have people outside walking, coming in contact with one another for good and for bad, and just more of an awareness of ourselves and our shared spaces outside of our homes and our garages. And I do think and then certainly sharing the interior space of whatever these vehicles are, these software trains, is bringing that friction, which, believe me, I mean, I went to high school in the New York City subway. I was a 13-year-old schoolgirl uniform. I'm just going to say it. Stuff happened. And so I can be afraid in public spaces, and it was all good. I mean, I'm laughing. It's not all good, right? It's like the New York City, the interior of a New York City subway car is real life. But at the same time, I think what you were describing, there's still that problem. Everyone's going to be in that car on their screens and not necessarily saying, hey, what do you do? But there's a lot of hope for that 15-minute walk and those 3 blocks and the new green spaces. So, yeah, that's what I think about.
Yeah, it's very easy to say, it won't necessarily be any better from a social perspective than what we currently have, but you never know unless you give it a go. I
Yeah.
suppose underlying all of this, what you're saying sounds like it would require like a massive social shift in the way in which people in Detroit, or probably more broadly in America, think about what they value and how they want to live their lives. And I imagine that that's going to run up against some fairly deeply ingrained social beliefs.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge with the message that I'm trying, which is why the project is really focused on the message as opposed to any kind of particulars of a vehicle design. And originally this project started because of the success of the My Robot Gets Me book. And then I had a publisher who was interested because I had mentioned this interest in public transportation and autonomous vehicles. And so it started out as a book proposal. And some of the reviews from experts came back a little harsh, a little saying, you know what, these are ideas that academics and urban planners have been talking about for many years. The bigger problem is changing people's minds and changing the mental model, for I forgot how you put it, for want of a better phrase, of what we expect to have as American families, as American cities. That's a huge challenge.
It is a huge challenge, and I think, without going into this too deeply, because I'm getting out of my depth here, but I imagine that some of the rational reasons for creating a more efficient public transportation system, the allocation of the resource shared across the demand of the people that want to engage with it versus keeping a car in your park for 90% of the time and only using it for the other 10%. Like, all of those rational reasons are conflated with a bunch of emotional thinking around the kind of scientific utopian, but maybe perhaps crossing over into what some people may consider, the collective or the commune. Like, it sort of veers into that territory for some people.
Yeah,
And
it's definitely
yeah,
it's definitely collectivism. Definitely asking people to think of our communities as a shared space as opposed to a collection of individual families and homes.
Well, it's certainly a bold endeavour, and I definitely wish you all the best. I think it's an important narrative to start to have more conversation about. So I hope it goes really well. You mentioned My Robot Gets Me, and I wanted to talk to you about that. I just refresh people's memory here. So you explore in the book how social design can be applied to smart technologies to make them more relatable and human-centered, or at least that was my take on things. And you've previously spoken about how the term robot or robots is problematic, so much so that you've said that we should deprogram ourselves from the popular sci-fi association that we hold when we think of a robot. What's wrong with the way we currently think about robots?
The essence of it are all of the stories that we have in our subconscious around seeing a robot as another human entity, humanish entity, and then so much baggage that goes along with it. And some of it's good, right? Some of it is along the lines of what I talk about in the book. Some of it is, hey, if you can just hand your appliance that I'm holding a cup and say, hey, can you clean all of these things up and put them in that cupboard? And I can just do it the way, like I wouldn't have to program that. That'd be a lot of code, only a lot of testing and code. If I could just do those gestures and point and hand things and have something that had hands and eyes and it could nod. And that's the field of social robotics. It's all thinking about all of those gestures and nuances and building those into so I'm kind of pro anthropomorphism in that sense, but then there is just this this larger narrative around thinking about, first of all, just the need for what I just described. And if I then ask someone, tell me what that appliance looks like. Now I'm calling it an appliance deliberately, right? If I called it a robot, suddenly folks think it's on two legs and it walks into your space. And so first, there's so many layers of why that's concerning. First of all, from just a really pragmatic design and engineering point of view, even just having something ambulatory as opposed to, let's say, on wheels, having it have two arms with fingers, all of every little motor that needs to go in every knuckle and those kinds of things, it's wasteful. So there's that, right? As opposed to thinking of maybe it's just pyramid that rolls into your space and because it's a pyramid because of the needs of the situation, a pyramid with cup holders in it, and a suction cups. But so there's that practical point of view, but then there's also just all of the fears and the horror stories that we've been fed about robots and robotics. And there's the very, very complex conversation around jobs and automation, right? Which it's a very big topic. And ultimately, I feel like that's a capitalism problem and not a technology problem. Again, it's kind of a distribution of resources and thinking communally. But, that really relies on corporate entities to be doing the right thing. And there are so many, I think, social political questions around that. But from, getting back to your core question, from a design point of view, when I bump up against it is often when I give talks, one of the questions that inevitably comes up, so for Diligent Robotics, for example, I was the head designer. I essentially drew this robot and made it in CAD and worked with this amazing team of engineers and the company founders, Andrea Tomaz and Vivian Chu. And we made it. We used the core value of the company is social robotics, and our design philosophy really embraces social robotics. So it has a head, it has kind of eyes. They're just LED rings, but it can gesture, it can nod, it can have gaze. So in other words, you feel like the robot is looking at you, and it can have shared attention. So you can, if there's a spill and I look at the spill, the robot can look at the spill. It has, it has gestures. Anyway, it's humanish. It's humanish again, right? And the question that comes up is, isn't this a terrible thing to create robots and take people's jobs? And when I hear that question, well, first of all, the robots, but Moxie is the name of the particular robot. The company is Diligent. The robots, Moxie, that's produced by Diligent, is specifically geared to a real painful need in the healthcare industry to relieve nurses of work that's so exhausting that they're quitting in droves, right? That they're, clocking 10 kilometers, actually clocking 10 miles, but in the hallways of the hospitals, they're sitting inside of closets doing assembly work for kits and things like that, instead of being at a patient's side. There's so much value to having the nurses not quit and get exhausted. So there's that, but granted, that's this particular sector. But, even something like, let's say, a school bus driver, I think is better served sitting with the kids and monitoring them than sitting behind the wheel, if we can have that part of it be automated. And when I think about it, the core of the question, I think, often comes from fear, and the fear comes from the use of the term robot. If you had so because if I think of that nurse's assistant, and even the fact I'm calling it an assistant, I mean, it's part of our design approach is to have the robot be a member of the team. But frankly, the robot is a tool. It's a tool. It happens to be a tool that can travel the hallways and go to the pharmacist and pick up meds and go in the elevator, like all of the challenges that I love in this design project. But it's a tool. It's a tool for nurses to help them do their job, right? But if once we call it a robot, then it starts to be an employee, and it's an employee, but it's not it's not actually an employee, right? So there are benefits to it. And actually, one of the things that I think Diligent has enjoyed, and that I've enjoyed, because sometimes there are a couple of these robots in the hospital near me. Sometimes I was there with a friend who needed to fill a prescription, and I just stopped someone, and I said, "Hey, I heard you." I did this terrible thing, playing. I heard there's a robot in this hospital. Is that true? Yeah, I totally did this sort of fly on the wall, and I love people light up and they go, "Oh, yeah, it's Moxie," and the nurses will greet her hey, and I saying, "Hey, girl," which brings up questions of gender, but it's "Hey, girl, Moxie, we're here. Yeah, do you have those meds?" So yeah, it's a robot. We designed a robot for sure, playing on the sci-fi definition of what we know about robot. But at its heart, it's a tool. It's a tool. If we have a dishwasher in our kitchen, it may have all the smarts and autonomy of what we would call a robot. And we don't have a problem with that until we give it arms and legs. Moving around in your home, that's also got a lot of questions. I mean, it's why I love this field. There are a lot of questions, right? But yeah, at the end of the day, we do let our the history of popular media, I think, take over in the way we think about things.
So, to summarize, James Cameron and people like him have ruined robots for the rest of us. Picking up on the job conversation, you've previously been asked about exactly what you've been talking about with regard to robots and the potential job losses that humans may experience. There's a lot of fear and assumption wrapped into those questions that are actually probably more like statements rather than questions. But that aside, when you were asked about this, I heard you respond. You were asked about how you as a designer ensured that the technology like Moxie you were working on wasn't put to use in such a way that it would result in outcomes that you didn't intend, such as people losing their jobs. And what you said, and I'll quote you now, was, you said a number of things, but one of them was, there's really no way to necessarily ensure what our objects will do in the future. And as much as that might be uncomfortable for some people to hear listening to this, that certainly seems to me to be more representative of the truth of the matter, or the facts that most designers experience out there while working for others. What is the best that designers can expect or do when working for companies that are making products that have the potential to be abused?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, especially since I work with young people just entering the field of design. It's a great question. It's an important question. When I was an undergraduate, there was an ethics class in engineering school that was part of our studies. And I think that, certainly doing your homework around who a potential employer is when you're taking a job, even if whether it's a freelance job or a full-time job, asking that employer questions about what the larger roadmap and strategy is for that product. I mean, if it's a full-time job or even not, I think we're at a place in design history where asking what a company's values are is an understood dialogue that is appropriate for a designer to ask. And if they don't get an answer and aren't given an answer, it's appropriate for that designer to say, well, I respectfully decline this opportunity. I think that designers in particular are in a really difficult place. Was it Victor Papanek in Design for the Real World who said, I'm going to mangle the quote, but something like design is one of the most dangerous fields that there is, right? I think there is, because the decisions that we make as designers then can impact the product that then is reproduced in the 100,000 or the millions, right? And the design decisions are important and influence, even it's subtleties, even like typography and color, or suggestions of gender, or suggestions of race, like all of these things. And I think that what makes it really difficult is like what I had said, that you were quoting me on, is you may have this understanding of what the use of this product will be, but you don't have the power to enforce that. It's a leap of faith. And I think we have the power to choose the projects that we work on. And that's also difficult, right? We all need to make a living. And you may work for a firm that says, well, we're going to, I mean, but back to like even Mad Men episodes, or like in the cigarettes, and I've worked in places where there were questions about things that might be habit forming, and do we want to design these things? So, but are they helping to break a habit, or are they helping to enforce the? I think, or does this encourage people to this cosmetic thing? Encourage people to spend money, or even like and there were things we don't even know, right? Like, well, before we kicked off the show, I had my dog Penny, who was rescued from a research lab, and then there are still dogs that are used for cosmetics research, and you can't as a designer even know everything like about I mean, I suppose you can, but there are things that you might not know about for a lawyer, and it's challenging.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's making me recall that, and I'll mangle the quote or the reference, that Nietzsche staring into the abyss. Like, you've got to be willing to do it, but you may not like what you find if you keep staring at it into it too long. I think ties back into what you were saying earlier around robots being viewed, or they should be viewed, as tools. And when it comes to designers' own thinking about themselves and their relation to their work, there's a higher level of awareness, or at least a smarts, I think, that's outside of the practice of design, that we're called to engage in, and thinking more broadly about the contribution we're making, so that we inadvertently aren't being used as tools within a system that we're not conscious of, even if we can't prevent every potential aberration that could happen with what we're doing. Coming back down now, sort of off the precipice of all the ethical concerns around the work, and thinking about the process that you've gone through, like the approach to designing these more human-like behaviors into robots, even if they may not be that sort of anthropomorphic style type robot. I understand one of the techniques that you've used, and perhaps borrowed from another field to explore this, has been something called the flour sack exercise.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what is the flour sack exercise?
I borrowed that I learned about that it's one of the things I love about teaching, because I wind up teaching and then blurring into other fields. And I was teaching a course that was for animators, and I learned that the animation students, as part of their degree, are required to do this flour sack exercise. And essentially what they're tasked to do is create an animation of a flour sack. So essentially a soft rectangle, and make it seem as though it's expressing emotions. And I think that the way that the exercise works is, one way that it might work is giving each student 5 emotions, let's say. So it's got to be, and it would have to feel bashful or celebratory, authoritative, let's say, right? And like, how do you make it? I always loved seeing, once I learned about this, like just looking through like how animation students have handled that exercise. And it was very interesting to me from a robot design point of view, because my point of view has always been that we should really play on abstraction rather than falling into the trap of elaborate anthropomorphism. And so there's an anthropomorphic effect to the flour sack exercise for sure. It's turned into it's using gestures that we can read as humans, but it's challenging the student to abstract that as much as possible.
I really like how you've previously talked about the design of social robotics, or in terms of how you've imbued those human characteristics into them so that we can understand them. And I'll paraphrase you here. You've said that the field of social robotics in part is a field that tries to design machines so that people only need to bring what they already know innately as humans to those interactions, which, as I said earlier, I think it's a really beautiful idea, and I can't think of like a more pure form of realizing a perfect user experience than just showing up and being able to naturally and effortlessly interact with this robot. How easy or difficult is that in reality to achieve?
No, and you paraphrase it perfectly, and it's incredibly difficult. And first of all, and I think, as in some ways, I think as designers, we intuitively would have always designed things that way, but the technology hasn't enabled it. But we're at this kind of perfect storm of having sophisticated sensors and broadband and connectivity so that we can have cloud robotics, so that it's not just computing happening locally, but then you can have some really sophisticated responses. But it's traditionally I've been working on product design for a long time, so I'm used to the ways that we design things were kind of with very canned responses, right? Where even and speech was something that was largely off the table, let alone gesture, really, really difficult from a computational and a hardware or software perspective, right? So now we're getting like when you can have cameras where I don't even know how cheap a camera might be is in terms of a component in product design. I mean, certainly $1 or two, and depending on, quantities, like all that kind of stuff. But so we're slowly getting to a point where the technology is there. And the biggest question is around the how we are defining the interaction. And so in the book I talk about 6 rings of what a team should think about and talk about and always come back to, right, as a core, right? So that's the framework of My Robot Gets Me. And the first one is presence, like what is the physical thing? Like is it a kiosk? Is it a desktop? Is it a table? Is it a bowl? That kind of thing. And then the second one is expression. Does it have lights? Does it, and then the third one is interaction. Well, once it's expressing outwards, how does it get like the sensor, what I just described, right? And then the next one is context. And context is one of the most challenging ones because it's in certain circumstances, you can isolate questions of context, but like inside a vehicle, for example, someone's likely sitting, they're likely inside the vehicle, right? But then, like in a kitchen, maybe you don't know. And when I talk about context, so I'm talking about everything that goes into deciding how a product should respond. So that is what's the temperature in the room, how loud is it, what time of day is it, what's going on politically, what are people's state of mind? I mean, all of that's context. Are they out? Is this product used outdoors or indoors? Like all of those questions, right? And they really affect what an appropriate response is. And then the last ring in the framework is ecosystem. So like products working together. But just staying on context for a minute, I've been thinking about this recently because I've been watching a television program on Apple TV that's called Sunny. And it has to. Oh, is this a spoiler? Is this going to be a spoiler if I tell? There's a trash can robot. There's a trash can robot that figures into a part of this television series, and uh, there's really talented software engineer who comes across this trash can robot and says, "Oh, this robot's terrible because it doesn't know the difference between it. So it knows how to pick up a can that's trash, but its definition was just anything that wasn't defined in its set of what trash is or what trash isn't." And then this engineer goes on to train the robot and gets to this sort of victorious moment when the training is these really it consists of these really sophisticated conversations where the robot is saying, "Oh, picking this up makes you sad, so I shouldn't pick it up." Like it really gets into these nuances of emotion and how each object has a different emotional value, and and why is that? Like, why is this cup trash and that one's not? And I thought, yeah, that's context. That's it. That's what I'm talking about.
This is sounding like that, perhaps like a holy grail of intelligence or discernment going on here in the way in which the robot's interpreting the context. Because a lot of that stuff's implied, I would imagine. Like, how would you know that, my favorite cup, even though it's really old and looks like trash, how would you know that was my favorite cup and not to pick that up? Like, a lot of that stuff we just, I suppose, take for granted in our surroundings in our day-to-day.
Yeah, I mean, and then what can you reasonably expect of a product, right? I mean, that's pretty sophisticated, right? To know that that's your old cup and it's not. Is that on the robot or is that on you, right? I think to put that and then I guess there's the human test too. Like, would a person throw that cup out, and could they reasonably be expected to understand that it had sentimental value?
And do people really want to buy robots that you have to parent? Because if you've already got kids, I'm not sure you want something else that you kind of have to coach and train to that degree. There might be an expectation that it would magically know. Coming to technology that seems like magic to a lot of people, perhaps outside of our field, a lot of the general population at the moment, and that technology is generative AI. There seems like there could be an overlap going on here between, say, something like social robotics and something like generative AI. How, if at all, is generative AI impacting the field of social robotics?
AI has been a big part of the robotics projects I worked on because it is core to camera vision. So, camera vision and it's core to navigation. So, a lot of the robots that I've worked on, like the robot with Diligent in the hospital, as well as some other consulting projects that I've had with clients. When it involves navigation, it's a pretty sophisticated task, to understand that that's a door and that's a chair and that's a person's foot. And so AI has been used for that for a long time before this recent explosion of public interest, which I think has more to do with large language models than it does really there's certainly a lot going on in computing as well that's been happening, but the large language models, I think, what has really captured the public imagination and the design industry for sure. So I'm struggling a little bit to really think about generative with the kinds of things that I work on, but it's an interesting question because I think that it has to do, I think certainly, again, large language models, certainly how that robot's going to respond in terms of now all of the conversational interfaces that we're starting to see. And I interacted with an AI robot, and I'm going to forget what the project is called, but there are two extremely humanoid robots that are set up in the lobby of the Sphere in Las Vegas. And and a person just approaches them. There's somebody there with a microphone that passes because there's a big crowd of people, and you ask that robot any question and the robot responds. So certainly being able to be convincing with this crowd by not having canned responses and being able to come up with those responses on the fly, I think is a part of it. And certainly the gesture, this robot had a lot of gestures. It was able to point at things and nod, and it had actually it was a very sophisticated mechanical thing. But yeah, I guess I'm thinking also about, I think there's tons of opportunity, even around, let's say you have a frame that acts like a monitor that also acts like a window. And does that change then depending on the time of day? I think you could go on with thinking about it. Did you have something in mind with your question?
Not particularly, but hearing you talk about speech a little earlier and then thinking about the capabilities of the Las Vegas robots, it kind of seems like that will be made a lot easier than it would have been in the past. Like you say, there's no need to do these branching conversational canned response type trees. You can kind of just let it respond and code it to do so in a more human, natural kind of way. Serious question now, seeing as you were in Las Vegas, was it red or black?
I have a hard time with Las Vegas. I live basically in a nature preserve right now. That's what Cranbrook is. I had a really hard time. But I also knew that given what my field is, especially what I teach, I felt like I need to see what the state of the art of what's going on in Vegas is.
We, at the very beginning of our conversation, spoke briefly about autonomous vehicles. And I want to come to a piece that you wrote in 2016 called Don't Blame the Robots, Blame Us, which was for Popular Science. And in that piece, you looked at the role of both the autonomous driving systems and the human beings that are involved and that are using them. As the title of your article suggests, how are we, the humans, to blame? And which humans were you talking of? Were you talking of the humans as in the designers or engineers, or the end users of the autonomous driving products?
That's a great question, and it's very important because by us, I was really talking about designers. I was really talking by and for designers. And my premise in the piece was, and I was asked to comment on the Tesla autopilot. And there had been a fatality recently when that piece was written. And, so there are a few us's in there. I think one of the us's for me at that time was certainly marketing and even just the use of the term autopilot, because a lot of what was happening at that time it was not full autonomy yet. Giving it a name like that has a suggestion that it is full autonomy. And there were many instances of people posting on YouTube where they were, napping or reading, or even though it was made clear to them upon purchasing the vehicle, and there's messaging in the car that you needed to still maintain awareness of the road. People weren't doing that. I also blame sci-fi movies for that as well, right? Like I had Desire, yeah, kids finally here, right? Or Heartbeat of Love Bug or whatever it is, right? But I think that at that time I was in some really intense conversations with some of my friends that were working around design of the interiors of autonomous vehicles, and all of the nuances of having the interior communicate to people what is happening. And what I can talk about in the piece is the robot brain, and that we have a certain mental model. If we think it's a fully autonomous thing, then we're going to treat it as such. So as designers, we need the interior of the vehicle to message to us, let us know what it doesn't. We're very myopic as humans, right? I think this is part of why we make humanoid things, because we're we're in our, like, we know as much as we can know about this, getting philosophical, but about the world through the experience of being human. So we kind of replicate that experience, or expect that experience. We expect that experience from primates, right? When we look at gorillas and chimps, like, we think that they're doing the same thing we're doing, right? It's very myopic. And so getting into an autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicle where we think that it it sees or it thinks about things the same way. So the challenge for designers, I think, is to communicate that robot brain, and let us know how decisions are being made by the vehicle. I think that's a big challenge, right?
Somewhat semi-provocative and direct question. Do you feel that as a society we're going to have to accept that there will be many more fatalities caused by these systems in pursuit of the greater good when it comes to the environment?
I think that's a pretty straightforward question. I mean, I think one of the things that caught my interest in autonomous vehicles were the statistics of how many people die in human error car fatalities, and comparing those numbers to what the prediction is for a fully autonomous system. One of the books that I really loved, and also had a super, it's also very provocative and difficult, is a book called Door to Door. And I don't have the author in top of mind, but I think it's easy to search up. And that book gets into some excruciating detail around the true numbers of fatalities that happen from human error in vehicles, and how much that can potentially be reduced. I think the difficult thing is that we're in the, this phrase I use with technology sometimes, we're still in the teenage years of autonomous vehicle testing, right? And so I think important that that testing be done responsibly and with limits. And I think a lot of it's happening on, let's say, campuses where it's contained, where the potential variables for what the autonomous system needs to understand are limited. And then branching out from that, even if it means that it takes several more years. I mean, it's a pretty difficult and complex question, and dependent on all of the circumstances. But there has been testing that was, or vehicles where people didn't know that the vehicles were just sent out into public city streets. And I think there are a lot of issues with that. But yeah, that Door to Door book, I listened to it as an audiobook on a long distance trip, and wow, was it hard. Because, like, the way that it talked about human error in automobile accidents is really rough. But it's also a very fascinating book around autonomy, and not just autonomous vehicles, but also all of the larger systems around freight and harbor and trucking and all of that.
Was it written by Edward Humes? Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
Yes.
That's the one.
Yeah. So for people listening, it's called Door to Door, The Magnificent, Maddening, Mysterious World of Transportation. Yeah, sounds like a really good read. And we were speaking before we hit record about you have also been a podcast host. You used to co-host the RoboPsych podcast. And I noticed that after 101 episodes, you literally ran out of experts to interview, and the podcast came to its sort of natural conclusion. How satisfied are you with the speed at which the field of social robotics has been developing?
So the founder of that podcast and my co-host, Dr. Tom Guariello, is a PhD psychologist. So I really loved that project. And we unfortunately don't have a public archive of it, but we had fantastic guests who were at the forefront of thinking and talking about every aspect of social robotics. We were disappointed with the speed at which social robots appeared in, let's say, home appliances. There was fascinating project that I was involved with in some early consulting stages that was called Jibo, It was led by Cynthia Brazil from really one of the founding experts in social robotics from the MIT Media Lab. And that was an incredibly promising product and did not, is not available anymore. And I think, like Tom and I were very excited about the potential for something like that. And it really kind of embodied a lot of the interaction principles that I talk about. But at the same time, it's tough to say what is a social robot or what isn't. At this point, we're going to see it. We're seeing it. We see even, I feel confident that we will start seeing. I know one of the examples I talk about is a microphone that has smarts and knows who's talking and knows when to point and knows when to shut itself down and expresses when it's on or when it's off. And, I know that designers are working on that. And I think a lot of it is the difficulty of, there's this phrase that's so silly, but I'm going to say it, right? Like people say hardware is hard. Hardware is difficult. It's challenging and expensive to have a motor that simply expresses, I'm going to sleep now, on a microphone, right? But I think that there's a greater public awareness and therefore greater willingness for companies to explore those nuances from a design point of view.
Carla, just mindful of time, I've got a couple of final questions to ask you. I want to turn our attention now to about a decade ago when you just published Leo the Maker Prince, which, as I mentioned in your introduction, but quick summary for people that may have just jumped to this part, is a children's book that enabled people to print the objects in 3D from the story if they had access to a 3D printer. Now, you've said previously that this was a homage to The Little Prince, which is a novella written in 1943, so I learned, by the exiled French writer, poet, and pioneering aviator Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. How did The Little Prince change you?
Oh, that's such a great question. What I loved about The Little Prince was, number one, the encouragement to dream and have a creative mind, even if you feel misunderstood, right? There's a lot in this book about talking to the grown-up and, the permission to never grow up, I think, in terms of hanging on to creative spirit. And the other thing that really influenced me was the way the book weaves drawing and the written word one into the other. And I think that was a large part of the inspiration for the Leo the Maker Prince book, because I felt like, let's weave three-dimensional objects into this story, this narrative, and get people excited about what the objects mean and why they exist or what the context of them is, but then have them be real things that people can hold and touch. And so that was, I remember that as a child. I remember reading about the baobab tree and then having this amazing illustration of the baobab tree, right? Or the way that the little prince moves his chair to see the sunrise just a little bit on this little planet. And then to actually, it could have just been the written word. It could have just, I guess maybe I was used to some format of a book that was either mostly pictures or mostly words, but the pictures were so meaningful to me.
Something that I hadn't heard of the book before, but when I was preparing for today, I had a deeper look into it and some of the history behind the author and what he was trying to convey through the book. And I've actually ended up buying it for my sons.
Cool. You'll have to let me know what you think. Yeah.
It's the second book I've actually bought as a result of doing the podcast. The first one was the Big Orange Splot. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one.
I don't know that part.
It's also one that I recommend if you've got children, because it explores that permission to be creative that seems to get beaten out of us at a far too earlier an age. Speaking of being creative, clearly what you do at Cranbrook Academy of the Art with what was called the 4D design program and is now the interaction design program is hugely creative. I've seen some of the work that your students have produced in the past, and you're currently a designer in residence there as well, right? So it's very, very creative work. It's at the crossover of, I think you call it this sort of form, code, and electronics. Like, it's very bleeding edge. What I was curious about, though, was that you've previously said, and I'll quote you one last time, that social commentary is something that just runs through everything we do. We're always trying to talk about what the technology implies, what the future of it might be. So where you currently sit now with your students that you've got working with you, what are the most striking or surprising social commentaries that you're seeing reflected in their work currently?
I think there's a lot of backlash against mobile devices, and looking at mobile devices as everything about technology. And it's interesting to me to prod them a little bit on to drill down into that, because I think that a lot of them just grew up with mobile devices or had, for most of their at least teenage young adult life. Whereas to me, it just feels like it's just so, like, it's magical, right? Like, I mean, I understand, like, that's a whole, like, 3 other podcasts, right? Like, the daily glories and pitfalls of mobile devices. But, I think that they're looking at that. They're looking a lot at gender and identity and how that's formed and influenced by everything that we interact with, and how, as designers, we can make a difference in terms of thinking about those things. Yeah, I think that they are working a lot with gesture, which we don't see as much yet in everyday products. Like, I have a student now, Jessica Harvey, who's working a lot with kinetic sculptures that respond to a particular way of approaching it in terms of where the body is and how, I think everything around, a lot around um, students that work with wearable electronics and thinking about the how the form relates to the body. And
I may have suggested that was the last time I would quote you, but this will be the absolute last time I'll quote you today. And I want to take you back now to 2017 when you were standing on stage at TEDx Brussels. You said, "The robots are here. We can have them taunt us. We can have them coach us. We can have them nag us. We can have them encourage us to be better, but it's up to us to know our limits." What did you mean when you said it's up to us to know our limits?
I had a lot of fun with that audience, because I started showing them images of what robots could be. And I think I started with an elevator, and then, went on to show them a dog walking robot, and say, would you want what about this? And then I showed them this nanny robot, which was like a composited picture of my child, who was like 2 at the time. And, this like 2-year-old just alone in a room with a robot, and the audience like really gasped, and I had some people tweeting like, "What a terrible talk, what a terrible thing to show," and which I'm glad, because that was exactly the point. It was meant as a provocation, and what I meant by that was that, as certainly designers, but even as consumers, like, we shouldn't just accept what is being offered to us at, point blank. That we should have conversations and think about and be critical and say, well, what does it mean to have a nanny robot? And what is that? What human interaction is that replacing? And is that a value that we support? And why or why not?
And it's funny to think that those same people that gasped at the idea of the nanny robot might not even think twice about leaving their 2-year-old in a room alone with a mobile device.
Right. I mean, which I think that's why my students, I have a hard time with the question about the mobile device, but that's sort of the part of the core question, right? Is that there are things like that that are actually happening right now. We don't, it's not as provocative as, or, incendiary as that image that I put up on the screen. But yeah, we need to talk about it as a society, and we need to be critical.
Carla, this has been a really timely and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for so generously sharing your stories and insights with me today.
Oh, thank you so much. Your questions have been great. And I really appreciate being part of your podcast.
My pleasure. Carla, if people want to get in touch with you, they want to follow along and be abreast of all the changes and contributions you've been making to the field of design, what's the best way for them to do that?
So the best way is I've always got some contact information on my website, which is just carladiana.com. And then I communicate best through Instagram. So it's just at Carla Diana.
And there's some really fun projects on there that people should check out that we didn't cover today, but definitely worth a look. Thank you, Carla. And to everyone who's tuned in, it's been wonderful having you here with us as well. Everything we've covered will be in the show notes, including where you can find Carla and all of the things that we've spoken about. If you've enjoyed the show and you want to hear more great conversations like this with world-class leaders in UX research, product management, and design, don't forget to leave a review, subscribe so it turns up every 2 weeks, and please pass the podcast along to just one other person who you feel would get value out of these conversations at depth. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Brendan Jarvis, or there's a link to my profile at the bottom of the show notes, or head on over to my website, which is thespaceinbetween.co.nz. That's thespaceinbetween.co.nz. And until next time, keep being brave.